You don't speak in this room, you take notes. The sentence didn't echo, but it didn't need to. It landed sharp, deliberate, like it had been rehearsed too many times to count. Naomi Carter didn't look up. Not immediately. Her pen kept moving across the page in smooth, controlled strokes, the faint scratch of ink against paper barely audible over the low hum of the conference room's ventilation system. 12 executives sat around a 30-foot glass table on the 42nd floor, overlooking downtown Chicago, sunlight reflecting off steel buildings and polished egos. Naomi sat at the far end, just outside the center of power, where people stopped noticing you after the first 5 minutes. She wore a simple black blouse, tailored but unremarkable, the kind of outfit designed to disappear in a room full of custom suits and polished shoes. That was intentional. It had always been intentional. Edward Langford didn't even glance at her as he leaned back in his chair, cufflinks catching the light. "We need efficiency," he continued, addressing the room like a man used to being heard. "And that starts with knowing who's here to contribute and who's here to observe." A few quiet chuckles followed. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to signal agreement. Naomi wrote every word down. She always did. For 10 years, she had been in rooms like this. Different tables, different deals, same tone, same assumptions. She had been mistaken for an assistant more times than she could count. Asked to grab coffee. Asked to print documents. Once, a visiting partner had handed her a coat without even asking her name. She took it, hung it neatly, returned to her seat, and kept writing. Because every moment like that came with something far more valuable than respect. It came with access. The meeting moved forward, voices overlapping, numbers thrown across the table like currency. 75 million. 120. 200 even. Naomi's pen didn't slow. She documented everything. The hesitation before a decision, the glance exchanged between two board members, the subtle shift in Edward's tone when someone questioned him. Details most people ignored. Patterns most people missed. Across the table, a junior analyst, fresh suit, nervous energy, glanced at her twice, then a third time. His brow furrowed, like something didn't add up, like he couldn't figure out why someone who never spoke was always present. Naomi didn't meet his eyes.
She didn't need to.
She had seen that look before.
Curiosity.
Confusion. The beginning of awareness. Edward stood up, pacing slowly, commanding the room with the ease of someone who had never been questioned long enough to doubt himself. "This acquisition defines our next decade," he said. "We control the outcome. We control the narrative."
Control.
That word again. Naomi underlined it once.
Calm.
Precise. Because she knew something no one else in that room did. Control wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to announce itself. Real control moved quietly. It waited. It listened. It learned. And for 10 years, Naomi Carter had done exactly that. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She didn't defend herself when they overlooked her, dismissed her, reduced her to background noise. Because while they were busy deciding who mattered, she was deciding when it would matter. The meeting paused for a brief moment as someone adjusted the projection screen. Light flickered across the glass table. Naomi's pen hovered just above the paper for the first time in hours. Not stopping. Just waiting. Timing, she had learned, was everything. Edward turned back toward the table, confident, composed, completely unaware of the shift already building beneath the surface. "Let's finalize this," he said. And for the first time in 10 years, Naomi Carter slowly lifted her eyes from the page. The room did not notice the shift at first. It never did, because nothing about Naomi Carter's movement was loud enough to demand attention. It was subtle, controlled, the kind of change that only became obvious when it was already too late. Her eyes, now lifted from the page, moved across the table slowly, taking in every face like she had done 1,000 times before, except this time there was something different. Not hesitation. Not restraint. Something final. Edward Langford kept speaking, unaware, his voice steady as he outlined projections and timelines, his confidence filling the room like it always had. "We're looking at a return curve within 18 months, he said, tapping the screen with a polished pen. "This positions us ahead of every competitor in the Midwest." Heads nodded. A few murmurs of agreement followed. The junior analyst glanced at Naomi again, longer this time, as if trying to solve a problem that did not belong on the spreadsheet in front of him. Naomi did not acknowledge him. Her focus remained forward. Always forward. 10 years earlier, she had sat in a much smaller room, not 42 floors above the city, but on the second floor of a building no one remembered anymore. She had worn the same kind of outfit. Simple.
Clean.
Invisible. She remembered the exact words that day. "You are not leadership material." The sentence had been delivered without anger, without hesitation, just like a fact that had already been decided before she walked in. She had nodded, thanked them for the opportunity, walked out without argument, because even then she understood something most people never did. Rejection was information, and information was leverage. Back in the present, Edward clicked to the next slide. Numbers shifted. Charts rose and fell. The room leaned in, drawn to the promise of control, of growth, of certainty. Naomi closed her notebook gently. The sound was soft, but in the silence between sentences, it carried further than expected. A few heads turned. Not all. Not yet. Edward paused for half a second, just enough to register the interruption, then continued. "We finalize today," he said. "No dilas." Naomi placed the pen down on top of the notebook, aligning it perfectly along the edge. Every movement precise. Every second measured. Across the table, the junior analyst straightened in his seat, his confusion now replaced with something closer to awareness. Because people who never spoke did not usually close their notebooks before the meeting ended. And people who were invisible did not usually command attention without trying. Naomi stood up. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough to shift the balance of the room. Chairs creaked slightly as a few executives adjusted, their attention now beginning to gather. Edward turned toward her, a faint crease forming between his brows, more annoyed than concerned. "We are in the middle of something," he said, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, just long enough for it to become uncomfortable. Then she looked directly at him. For the first time in 10 years, she did not look past him, around him, or through him. She looked at him. And in that moment, something unspoken moved through the room. Not fear. Not yet. But recognition. The kind that comes when a pattern breaks. "You said we control the outcome," she said, her voice calm, steady, and unmistakably clear.
No hesitation. No epaleji.
Just fact. Edward blinked, caught slightly off guard, but quickly recovered. "That is correct," he replied, his voice tightening just enough to signal that this was not part of his plan. Naomi nodded once, as if confirming something she had already known. "Then we should be precise about who he means," she said. A few executives shifted in their seats. The air in the room changed, subtle but undeniable. Because this was no longer observation. This was entry. And once someone entered the conversation after 10 years of silence, there was no going back to being invisible again. Naomi rested her hand lightly on the closed notebook, her gaze steady, her presence now impossible to ignore. "Because for the last 10 years, she continued, you have been speaking as if control was something you held." She paused, just long enough for the weight of the sentence to settle, then added quietly, "That assumption is about to be tested." The silence after Naomi Carter's words did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like something invisible had just shifted its weight in the room. No one spoke immediately. That alone was unusual. In this room, someone always filled the gap, usually Edward Langford, usually with certainty. But this time, even he hesitated. Just for a second. And in that second, Naomi saw it. The crack.
Small.
Almost invisible. But real. Edward straightened slightly, adjusting his cuff as if recalibrating the moment. Back into something familiar. "Tested," he repeated, a faint smile returning to his face, controlled but thinner than before. "I am not sure this is the time for hypotheticals." A few executives nodded, relieved to have something to agree with. Structure. Order. Normalcy. Naomi did not sit down. She did not rush to explain herself. She simply stood there, steady, her hand still resting on the notebook like it anchored her to something deeper than the room itself. "It is not a hypothetical," she said calmly. "It is a timeline." That word landed differently. Timeline. Not argument. Not opinion. Something measured. Something already in motion. Across the table, the junior analyst leaned forward slightly, his attention now fully locked. Others followed, slower, more cautious. Because there was something in Naomi's tone that did not ask for permission. It assumed it. Edward let out a quiet breath through his nose, a controlled exhale, the kind used to dismiss tension without acknowledging it. "Naomi," he said, using her name now for the first time in the meeting, "we are discussing a $200 million acquisition. If you have notes, you can forward them after the meeting." A subtle shift in tone. Polite. Contained. But still dismissive. Still placing her back where he believed she belonged. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. The pattern had not changed. Not yet. "You are right," she said. "This is about a $200 million acquisition." She paused, letting the number settle, letting the room reconnect with what they thought mattered most. Then she continued, "Which is why it is important that everyone here understands who is actually positioned to authorize it." The word authorize did not echo, but it did not need to. It redirected the entire conversation. Approval. Power. Final say. These were not background words. These were the words that decided outcomes. Edward's smile faded just enough to be noticeable. "That authority sits with the executive board," he replied, his voice firmer now, less relaxed. "And, as you know, those decisions are made collectively." Naomi nodded once, slowly. "Collectively," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the word itself. Then her gaze shifted, not away, but outward, scanning the faces around the table. One by one, measuring reactions, watching recognition build in places it had not existed moments before. Because some of them were starting to remember things. Documents they had signed. Meetings they had attended. Votes that had seemed procedural at the time. "That is true," Naomi said. "Decisions are made collectively." Another pause. Not long. Just enough. But influence is not. The room tightened again. Subtle. Controlled. But undeniable. Edward took a step forward, closing the distance between them slightly, his posture more rigid now. "If you have something specific to say," he said, "you should say it clearly." Naomi looked at him, steady, unshaken. "I have been," she replied. Then she reached for the notebook. Not to open it, not to write, but to lift it. She held it lightly, almost casually, but there was nothing casual about what it represented. 10 years of observation. 10 years of patterns. 10 years of decisions made by people who never thought they were being studied. "For 10 years, she said, her voice still calm, still measured, "I have been in every room that mattered. I have documented every major decision, every internal conflict, every shift in leadership direction." A few executives exchanged glances now. Quiet, uneasy, because they were beginning to understand something they had never considered before. Being ignored did not mean being unaware. Naomi continued, her tone unchanged. "I know who hesitates before they vote. I know who changes their position when pressure is applied. I know which deals were rushed, which ones were forced, and which ones should never have been approved." Edward's jaw tightened slightly. Not visibly enough for most. But Naomi saw it. She had been watching long enough to recognize the smallest changes. "And more importantly," she added, "I know who benefits from each of those decisions." The room did not move. No one reached for a pen. No one checked their phone. Because the conversation had moved somewhere else now. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere they could not easily control. Naomi lowered the notebook slightly, her gaze still steady. "So, when we talk about control," she said quietly, "we should be very careful about who we assume has it." No one interrupted her this time. Not because they agreed, but because they were trying to understand where this was going and, more importantly, how far it could go. The air in the room had changed completely. It was no longer about projections or acquisitions or quarterly returns. It was about exposure. Edward Langford felt it before he admitted it. The subtle shift from control to uncertainty. And he did not like it. "You are describing observations," he said, his voice sharper now, less polished, more defensive. "That does not translate to authority." Naomi Carter did not react to the edge in his tone. She had heard sharper. Dismissal dressed as logic was nothing new to her. "You are right," she said evenly. "Observation alone does not create authority." She took a step forward, closing the distance between her and the center of the table, her presence no longer at the edge, no longer peripheral. Now she was part of the axis, everything rotated around. "But understanding how decisions are made," she continued, "who influences them and why they change, that creates leverage." The word leverage landed heavier than anything she had said so far. Because leverage was not theoretical. It was actionable. Across the table, one of the senior executives shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to recall something he had overlooked. Another glanced down at the documents in front of him, not reading them, just needing somewhere to look that was not Naomi. Edward remained still, but his posture had changed. The ease was gone. In its place was calculation. "Leverage," he repeated, slower this time, testing the word like it might reveal something if he turned it enough times. "And what exactly are you implying you have leverage over?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, let the room lean into it, let the silence do its work. Then she reached into her bag and placed a thin folder on the table. Not thick, not dramatic, just enough to exist.
She
did not open it. She did not slide it toward anyone. She simply let it sit there. "Patterns," she said quietly. "Consistent ones." A few eyes dropped to the folder, not because they knew what was inside, but because they suddenly needed to know. "Every major vote in this room over the last 5 years follows the same structure," Naomi continued. "Initial resistance from 2 members, quiet alignment from 3 others, and final approval once the outcome is no longer in question." The junior analyst's eyes widened slightly. He had seen that pattern before, but he had never said it out loud. Naomi had. "That is not coincidence," she added. "That is influence." Edward took a step closer to the table, his fingers resting against the glass surface, grounding himself in something tangible. "You are making broad claims," he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now, less authority behind the words. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "I am describing a system," she replied. "One that has been predictable for a very long time." Another executive cleared his throat, quietly, almost involuntarily. The sound cut through the tension like a small fracture, because they were starting to see it too. Not fully, not yet, but enough to feel uncomfortable. Naomi placed her hand lightly on the folder. "And systems can be studied," she said. "They can be mapped. And eventually," she paused, just long enough for the room to hold its breath without realizing it, "they can be redirected." The word redirected did not sound aggressive.
It did not need to.
It sounded inevitable. Edward straightened, his jaw tightening, his confidence now replaced with something more rigid, more fragile. "You are overstepping," he said, the words coming faster now, less controlled. "This meeting is not about internal speculation. It is about finalizing a deal." Naomi nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "That is what you believe," she said. "But this meeting has always been about control." She glanced briefly at the folder, then back at the room. "And control does not belong to whoever speaks the loudest." The room fell silent again. Not the passive silence from before. This was different. This was awareness settling in. Naomi's voice lowered slightly, not in volume, but in tone, more focused, more precise. "It belongs to whoever understands the structure everyone else is standing on." And for the first time since the meeting began, no one looked at Edward for direction. They looked at her. No one spoke after that. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone was recalculating what they thought they understood. The room had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and they all felt it. Naomi Carter did not rush to fill the silence. She had learned long ago that silence, when used correctly, forced people to confront what they would rather ignore. Her hand remained resting lightly on the folder, not protective, not possessive, just present, as if it had always belonged there. Edward Langford looked around the table, searching for alignment, for someone to restore the structure that had just been disrupted. But no one moved to support him. No one interrupted her. That absence said more than any words could have. "This is not how decisions are made," Edward said finally, his voice lower now, controlled but strained at the edges. "You do not walk into a strategic meeting and attempt to rewrite authority based on interpretation." Naomi's expression did not change. "I am not rewriting anything," she replied. "I am clarifying what has already been established." A few executives exchanged glances again, longer this time, more deliberate. Because clarification implied something had been misunderstood, and none of them liked the idea that they might have been operating under incomplete information. Naomi reached for the folder and opened it slowly, deliberately, turning it so the contents faced the center of the table. Inside were not dense reports or complicated charts, just a series of clean, organized documents, voting records, shared distributions, authorization structures, each page labeled, each detail precise. "Over the last 10 years, she said, there have been 37 major decisions made in this room that required board-level approval. Her finger moved lightly across the first page, not pointing,
just guiding.
In 28 of those decisions, the final outcome was determined before the official vote occurred. The junior analyst leaned forward further now, his chair barely making a sound. Others followed, drawn in not by emotion, but by recognition. Naomi continued, her tone steady, factual. That outcome was not determined by discussion. It was determined by influence distribution. Edward's jaw tightened again, more visibly this time. "You are misrepresenting internal dynamics," he said, but the words lacked the weight they once carried. Naomi looked at him calmly.
"No," she said.
"I am quantifying them." She turned another page. "And influence in this structure has always been tied to equity position." The word equity shifted the room again, because that was not a casual term. That was ownership. That was control in its most concrete form. One of the senior executives straightened suddenly, as if a delayed realization had just reached him. His eyes moved from the documents to Naomi, then back again. "These records," he said slowly. "Where did you get access to this level of detail?" Naomi met his gaze, without hesitation. "I did not get access," she said. "I earned it." The answer was simple. Too simple. And that was what made it unsettling. Edward stepped closer now, no longer pacing, no longer performing. This was no longer about the room. This was about containment. "Even if what you are suggesting has merit," he said, choosing his words more carefully now, "it does not change the current structure. Authority still sits with the board." Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the statement. "Yes," she said, "it does." She let that agreement settle, let it create a moment of false stability. Then she turned the final page in the folder. "Which is why the current structure is the only thing that matters." The page was different from the others. Cleaner. More recent. A summary. Share percentages. Names aligned with numbers.
No commentary. No interpretation.
Just fact. The room leaned in without meaning to. Eyes scanning. Calculating. Recalculating. Naomi did not need to explain what they were looking at. They understood numbers. They always had.
One.
Executive's expression shifted first. Subtle, but unmistakable. Then another. And another. Because the distribution on that page did not match what they thought it was. It was not dramatically different. It did not need to be. Just enough to change the balance. Just enough to move control. Edward's eyes moved across the page more slowly than the others. Careful. Precise. As if reading it too quickly might make it real. "This is incomplete," he said, but there was no certainty behind it now. Naomi closed the folder gently. "No," she said quietly. "It is current." The word current settled over the room like a final piece falling into place. Because if it was current, then it was active. And if it was active, then everything they thought they controlled was already shifting. Naomi looked around the table once more, her gaze steady, composed. No trace of hesitation left. For 10 years, she said, you assumed I was observing your decisions. She paused, just long enough for them to feel the weight of what came next. You never considered that I was positioning mine? The word current did not leave the room. It stayed there, suspended between them, forcing every person at the table to reconsider what they thought was fixed. Numbers had always been their language. Percentages.
Shares.
Margins. They trusted numbers because numbers did not argue. But now the numbers were saying something none of them expected. Naomi Carter did not move to explain further. She had already said enough. The rest was calculation.
And she knew they would do it themselves.
Across the table, one of the senior executives leaned closer to the document, his finger tracing the distribution line by line, silently adding, subtracting, comparing. Another reached for his tablet, pulling up internal records, his screen reflecting faintly in the glass surface beneath him. The room, once driven by one voice, had fractured into individual analysis. Edward Langford remained still, but the stillness was different now. It was no longer control. It was containment. He was trying to hold the narrative in place while it shifted beneath him. Equity positions do not change without board awareness, he said, his voice measured, but the precision now sounded forced. Naomi turned her gaze toward him, not sharply, not aggressively, just directly. They do not change without documentation, she replied. Awareness depends on attention. The distinction was small, but it was enough, because attention in this room had never been equally distributed. Some things were reviewed carefully. Others were approved quickly, assumed to be procedural. Naomi had learned early which ones mattered. A quiet memory surfaced, not for the room, but for her. 3 years earlier, a minor restructuring proposal had been presented at the end of a long meeting. Most of the room had been ready to leave. The language was technical. The implications were not obvious. It passed without discussion. Naomi had written every word of it down. 2 years before that, a secondary share transfer had been buried in a quarterly report. It was small enough to avoid attention, large enough to matter later. She had noted the names, the percentages, the timing. 1 year ago, a consolidation clause had been activated during a routine adjustment. No one questioned it. It aligned with previous patterns. It made sense on the surface. Naomi had underlined it twice. Back in the present, she spoke again, her voice steady, almost quiet. There were moments, she said, when decisions were made quickly because they appeared insignificant. A few heads lifted, not all at once, but enough. Those moments were not insignificant, she continued. They were structural. The word structural shifted something deeper. Because structure was not visible in a single decision. It was built over time, layer by layer, choice by choice. Edward's hand pressed lightly against the table, his fingers spreading slightly, grounding himself again. Even if what you are implying is accurate, he said, choosing his words carefully, it would require alignment across multiple positions to alter control. Naomi nodded once. It did.
No hesitación. No elaboración.
Just confirmation. The simplicity of the answer was what unsettled them, because alignment did not happen by accident. It required intent, planning, patience. The junior analyst looked at Naomi differently now, not with curiosity, not with confusion, but with recognition, like he was seeing the full outline of something that had been there the entire time. You are tracking all of this, he said quietly, almost to himself. Naomi did not look at him, but she answered. I was understanding it. The correction was subtle, but it mattered. Tracking implied observation. Understanding implied control. One of the executives who had been silent until now leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. If this distribution is accurate, he said, then the influence balance is no longer where we thought it was. Naomi's gaze moved briefly toward him. It has not been for a while, she said. That sentence landed heavier than anything before it, because it meant this was not new. This was not sudden. This was already in place, already active. Edward finally stepped away from the table, just slightly, creating distance not from Naomi but from the center of the room itself. Why now? He asked, the question coming without preparation, without strategy. Just need. Naomi looked at him. Fully.
Directly.
Because timing determines outcome, she said. Then she glanced briefly at the folder, then back at the room. And this is the moment where outcome becomes visible. The room fell silent again. But this silence was different. It was no longer confusion. It was realization. Because everything she had said pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. Control had already shifted. They just had not seen it happen. Naomi's voice lowered slightly, steady, grounded. You believed control was something you held because no one challenged it, she said. But control is not defined by who speaks. She paused, just long enough for the weight of the truth to settle completely. It is defined by who positioned themselves when no one was paying attention. And now, finally, they were. The realization did not arrive all at once. It moved across the room in fragments, in small shifts of posture, in quiet glances exchanged between people who had spent years believing they understood exactly how power worked here. Naomi Carter stood at the center of it without moving, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had always belonged in that position, and the room was only now catching up to the truth. No one returned to their notes. No one reached for the projection screen. The $200 million deal that had filled the room minutes earlier now felt distant, almost irrelevant, like a conversation from another time. Edward Langford exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but no longer confident. He had built his authority on certainty, on momentum, on the assumption that he was always one step ahead. But now he was recalculating in real time, and that was not a position he had ever been comfortable in. If control has shifted, he said, his voice lower now, less performative, then it would require formal acknowledgement. The word acknowledgement hung in the air, careful, strategic, an attempt to reframe what was happening into something procedural, something manageable. Naomi's eyes met his without hesitation.
It already has been, she said. No emphasis. No dramatics.
Just fact. A quiet tension moved through the executives again, sharper this time. Because acknowledgement meant records. It meant signatures. It meant decisions they had already made, without fully understanding their implications. One of the senior members reached for his tablet again, scrolling faster now, his eyes narrowing as he searched through archived approvals and filings. Another leaned back, his expression tightening as pieces began to connect in ways he could not ignore. Naomi let them search. She did not interrupt. She did not guide. Because discovery was more powerful when it felt like their own. Across the table, the junior analyst spoke again, his voice steadier now, but still edged with disbelief. Those approvals, they were categorized as operational adjustments, he said, almost thinking out loud. Naomi nodded once. They were presented that way, she replied. The distinction was subtle, but it mattered. Presented did not mean defined. Edward's gaze sharpened slightly. And you expect this room to accept that a series of minor adjustments resulted in a fundamental shift in authority? He asked. There was a hint of challenge in his tone again, but it lacked the dominance it once carried. Naomi did not step back from it. I do not expect anything, she said. I am showing you what has already occurred. The room tightened again, because expectation implied debate. Occurrence implied finality. One of the executives who had remained silent for most of the meeting finally spoke, his voice slower, more deliberate. If this is accurate, he said, then the current voting structure would no longer reflect actual influence. Naomi turned her head slightly toward him. That is correct, she said. The confirmation was immediate.
Certain. No hesitation.
Edward shifted his stance, his weight moving from one foot to the other, a small detail, but one Naomi had learned to read years ago. It meant pressure. It meant adjustment. Then the only question left, he said, is who now holds that influence. The room stilled again. Not because they did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way none of them could reverse. Naomi did not rush to claim it. She had never rushed anything. Instead, she looked at the table, at the glass surface that had reflected every decision made here for the last decade, every assumption, every oversight. Then she looked back up. Influence does not appear suddenly, she said. It accumulates. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet weight behind it now, something that had been building for years and was finally reaching the surface. It builds in the spaces where people are not paying attention, in the moments they dismiss, in the details they assume do not matter. A few executives lowered their gaze slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, because they could remember those moments. They could remember the decisions they had signed without question, the approvals they had rushed, the names they had not looked at twice. Naomi continued, her tone steady, grounded in something deeper than the room itself. For 10 years, I was present in every one of those moments, she said. Not to challenge them, not to stop them, but to understand how they worked. She paused just long enough for the full weight of that to settle. And once you understand a system completely, she added, you no longer need permission to move within it. The room did not react outwardly, but something internal shifted again, something deeper, something final. Edward held her gaze, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that suggested this could still be redirected. But there was nothing there. Only clarity. Only control. Naomi took a small step forward, not aggressive, not forceful, just enough to close the last remaining distance between her and the center of the table. You asked who holds the influence now, she said quietly. Then she let the silence stretch just long enough to make the answer unavoidable. You are already looking at her. The words did not echo, but they did not need to. You're already looking at her. That sentence settled into the room like a final calculation, one that no one could revise once it had been understood. No one laughed. No one challenged her immediately, because the evidence was already in front of them, and more importantly, it was inside their own memory. The approvals they had signed, the documents they had skimmed, the moments they had dismissed. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice. She did not step further forward. She simply remained where she was, steady, grounded, as if the center of the room had quietly shifted to align with her presence. Edward Langford looked at her differently now. Not with dismissal, not with irritation, but with something sharper, recognition mixed with resistance. That is a strong claim, he said, his tone controlled, but no longer dominant. One that requires more than implication. Naomi nodded once, as if she had expected that response long before he spoke it. Of course, she said. Clarity matters. She turned slightly, her hand moving back to the folder, but instead of opening it again, she reached into her bag and removed a second document. Thinner. More precise. She placed it on the table, without sliding it toward anyone. Just close enough for the nearest executives to see the header. A formal filing. Date stamped. Signed. Recognized. One of the executives leaned forward, his eyes scanning quickly, then slowing, then stopping completely. His posture shifted in a way that could not be hidden. This was filed last quarter, he said, his voice lower now, almost cautious. Naomi did not look at him. She already knew what he was seeing. Yes, she said. It was processed through standard channels. Standard channels. The phrase that had allowed it to pass unnoticed. Another executive reached for the document, pulling it slightly closer, his eyes moving faster now, verifying, cross-checking, searching for inconsistency. There was none. Edward stepped closer, his hand hovering just above the table before finally resting against it. He did not pick up the document. Not yet. As if touching it would confirm something he was not ready to accept. This filing, he said slowly, adjusts consolidation rights. Naomi met his gaze. Correct. The room tightened again. Consolidation rights were not minor. They were not procedural. They determined who could unify shares under a single directive, who could align votes without needing permission, who could act without waiting for consensus. One of the senior executives leaned back in his chair, exhaling quietly, his eyes no longer on the document, but on Naomi herself. That would mean, he began then stopped, as if saying it out loud required more certainty than he felt. Naomi finished the thought for him. It means the influence you assumed was distributed, she said, is now concentrated. No one interrupted her, because they could see it now. Not just the structure, but the timing, the sequencing. the precision. This had not been a single move. It had been a series of them, layered, aligned, invisible until they were complete. Edward finally reached for the document, lifting it carefully, his eyes scanning each line, slower than the others had. Not because he needed more time to understand it, but because he already did. This would require coordination, he said, his voice quieter now. Across multiple positions. Naomi nodded once. It did. The same answer as before. Simple. Final. The junior analyst spoke again, his voice steady, but filled with something new. Respect. You built this, he said. Naomi did not smile. She did not acknowledge the tone. She only answered. I understood the system, she said. And then I moved within it. The distinction remained. Always precise. Always intentional. One of the executives who had remained silent throughout the meeting leaned forward slightly, his expression no longer skeptical, but focused. If consolidation rights have shifted, he said, then final authorization no longer requires full board alignment. Naomi turned her gaze toward him. That is correct, she said. The confirmation landed with finality. Because that was the last piece. The point where influence became action. Where structure became authority. Edward lowered the document slowly, placing it back on the table with more care than necessary. His movements were controlled, but the absence of certainty was now visible. Not dramatic, not obvious, but present. He looked at Naomi, searching again, not for weakness this time, but for intention. So this meeting, he said, is not about the acquisition. Naomi held his gaze. It never was, she replied. The room went still again. Completely still. Because everything they thought they were here to decide had already been decided.
Just not by them.
Naomi's voice remained calm, steady, grounded in something that had taken years to build. You believed this was the moment you would define the future of this company, she said. But the future was already being structured while you were focused on the present. She paused, just long enough for the full weight of that truth to settle across every person in the room. Then she added quietly, and now it is simply being revealed. No one moved after that. Not because they were unsure of what to do, but because the realization had reached a point where action required acceptance, and acceptance was not something this room gave easily. The glass table reflected every face, every subtle shift in expression, every quiet calculation happening behind composed exteriors. Naomi Carter stood still, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer questioned, no longer overlooked. She had not raised her voice. She had not forced authority into the room. She had simply revealed it. Edward Langford exhaled slowly, his eyes still, fixed on the document in front of him, but no longer reading it. He was thinking, reconstructing, searching for the moment where this could have been stopped. You said this was about timing, he said finally, his voice measured, quieter than before. So why reveal it now, in this room, during this meeting? Naomi looked at him, steady, unshaken. Because this is the moment where decisions carry consequences, she said. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Because consequences were not abstract. They were immediate.
Real.
One of the executives leaned forward slightly, his voice cautious. If consolidation rights are now aligned with your position, he said, then you have the ability to approve or deny this acquisition without full board agreement. Naomi nodded once. Yes, she said. The confirmation settled across the room, like a final line drawn in place. The deal that had dominated the conversation at the beginning of the meeting was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to her. Edward straightened, his posture shifting again, not into dominance, but into strategy. Then this becomes a negotiation, he said, the word chosen carefully, deliberately. Negotiation implied balance. It implied that power, even if shifted, could still be exchanged. Naomi did not react immediately. She let the word sit there, examined it without acknowledging it. Then she responded. No, she said calmly. It does not. The simplicity of the answer removed the structure he was trying to build. Negotiation required equal footing. This was not equal footing. The room felt it. The absence of tension from her side made the tension from everyone else more visible. One of the senior executives spoke again, his tone more measured now. "If not negotiation," he said, "then what is the purpose of this meeting now?" Naomi's gaze moved briefly across the table, taking in each person, not as obstacles, but as variables. Then she answered. "Clarity," she said. The word landed clean.
Direct.
Unavoidable. "For 10 years," she continued, "decisions in this room have been made under the assumption that authority was stable." She paused, just long enough for the memory of those decisions to surface in their minds. That assumption is no longer accurate. Edward's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt, because he understood now that interruption would not change the outcome. Naomi took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but precision. "This acquisition," she said, "is not just a financial move. It is a structural one. It determines who controls direction for the next decade." She let that settle because now they all understood exactly what was at stake. Not just profit. Control. Direction. Legacy. The junior analyst leaned forward again, his voice quieter, but steady. "And you are saying that control already sits with you," he said. Naomi did not look at him, but she answered clearly. "I am saying that control is already positioned," she replied. The distinction mattered. Position meant it had been built, prepared, ready. One of the executives who had been reviewing the documents set his tablet down slowly. "Then the outcome of this deal," he said, "depends entirely on your decision." Naomi finally allowed a slight shift in her posture, not dramatic, just enough to signal movement. "Yes," she said. The word did not need emphasis. It was already understood. Edward looked at her, not with dismissal, not with irritation, but with something closer to respect, though he would not call it that. "Then I will ask directly," he said. "Do you intend to approve this acquisition?" The room held still, completely still, because that question carried everything with it. 10 years of silence. 10 years of observation. 10 years of positioning. Naomi Carter looked at him, her expression calm, her voice steady, her presence undeniable. She did not answer immediately. She let the silence build, let the weight of the moment settle fully, let them feel what it meant to wait for someone they had ignored for a decade. Then she spoke. "That depends," she said quietly. And for the first time since the meeting began, every person in that room understood exactly what it felt like to wait for her decision. That depends. The words did not rush out. They did not demand attention. But they held the entire room in place. No one moved. No one spoke. Because for the first time in 10 years, the outcome of a decision in that room was not already known before it was asked. Naomi Carter stood steady, her gaze level, her posture unchanged, as if the weight of that moment had been familiar to her long before anyone else felt it. Edward Langford watched her carefully now, no longer trying to control the conversation, but trying to understand the conditions behind it. "Depends on what?" he asked, his voice measured, stripped of its earlier certainty. Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch again, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of the shift that had already taken place. Then she moved. Not toward the center of the table, not toward Edward, but toward the window. 42 floors above the city, the skyline stretched out in clean lines and distant motion, a reminder of scale, of time, of perspective. She looked out for a moment, not to avoid the room, but to reset it. Then she spoke. "For 10 years, she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying without effort, this company has made decisions based on short-term alignment. A few executives shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in recognition." Naomi continued, still facing the window. "Decisions that prioritized immediate return over structural strength. Decisions that relied on influence rather than clarity. Decisions that assumed continuity without questioning direction." She turned back toward the table slowly, her eyes moving across each person again, not searching, not challenging, just acknowledging. "This acquisition follows that same pattern," she said. Edward stepped forward slightly, his focus sharpening. "It is a strong opportunity," he said. "The projections support it." Naomi nodded once. "The projections support a version of it," she replied. A version that assumes the same structure will hold. She paused, letting that distinction settle. It will not. The room tightened again, not from confusion, but from the realization that the conversation had moved beyond numbers into something more fundamental. One of the senior executives leaned forward, his tone careful. "Then what changes?" he asked. "If the structure changes?"
Naomi
Rested her hand lightly on the back of a chair, grounding the moment without drawing attention to it. "Everything," she said. The answer was simple, but it expanded in the room like a ripple. Because everything meant strategy, leadership, direction, risk. Everything meant they were no longer operating under the same assumptions. Edward held her gaze. "So your decision," he said, "is not based on the deal itself." Naomi met his eyes directly. "It is based on what the deal reinforces," she replied. The clarity of that statement removed any remaining ambiguity. This was no longer about approval or rejection. It was about alignment. One of the executives who had been silent until now spoke again, his voice slower, more deliberate. "Then the question is not whether the acquisition is viable," he said. "It is whether it fits the structure you are defining." Naomi nodded once. "Correct." The room settled into that understanding, each person recalibrating their position within a system that no longer responded the way it had before. Edward exhaled quietly, the sound controlled, but no longer masking uncertainty. "And if it does not," he asked, "then you will deny it." Naomi did not answer immediately. She walked back toward the table, her steps measured, her presence steady. When she reached her place, she rested her hand lightly on the closed notebook again, the same notebook she had used for 10 years, now no longer a symbol of observation, but of completion. "If it does not," she said, her voice calm, precise, "then it will not move forward in its current form." The distinction mattered. Not rejection, not dismissal, redefinition. The room absorbed that slowly because it meant the deal was not theirs to execute anymore. It was hers to reshape. The junior analyst leaned back slightly, his expression no longer uncertain, but focused, as if he had just witnessed the exact moment a system changed direction. Edward looked at Naomi, not as someone to correct, not as someone to dismiss, but as someone he now had to understand. "Then what is move forward?" he asked. Naomi held his gaze, steady, composed, her voice grounded in something that had taken a decade to build. "The version that aligns with where this company is actually going," she said. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one in that room questioned who would decide what that direction would be. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not, because normal had been built on assumptions that no longer held. Naomi Carter stood at the table with the same calm presence she had carried for 10 years, but now that presence had weight.
direction.
Authority that no one could ignore or redirect. The executives did not speak immediately, not because they had nothing to say, but because every response now required recalibration. Their roles, their influence, their certainty, all of it had shifted. Edward Langford broke the silence first, but his voice no longer carried the same automatic command. It was measured, deliberate, almost careful. "Then outline it," he said. "If the current version does not move forward, define the one that does." Naomi did not hesitate, not because she had just decided, but because she had decided long before this moment ever arrived. "The structure changes first," she said. "Not the numbers, not the timing, the structure." A few executives leaned in slightly, their attention now fully aligned with her. Not out of obligation, but necessity. "This company has been operating in reaction," she continued, "responding to opportunities as they appear, adjusting based on pressure, aligning based on influence." She paused briefly, letting the pattern settle in their minds. "That ends now." The words were not loud, but they were final. Edward watched her closely, not interrupting, not dismissing, but listening in a way he had never needed to before. Naomi's hand rested lightly on the table, her posture grounded, her voice steady. "From this point forward, decisions will be built around long-term positioning," she said. "Not short-term alignment. That means every acquisition, including this one, must support structural control 5 years out, not just immediate return within 18 months. The numbers she used were familiar to them, but the perspective was not. 5 years out required a different kind of thinking, a different kind of discipline. One of the senior executives nodded slowly, almost involuntarily, as if the logic was undeniable even if it disrupted everything they were used to. Naomi continued without pause. The current version of this deal expands revenue, she said, but it does not strengthen control. It introduces dependencies that dilute decision authority over time. A subtle shift moved through the room as that implication settled. Dependencies meant vulnerability, something they had not accounted for because they had been focused on growth. Edward's expression tightened slightly. And your version avoids that, he said. It was not a question. It was a test. Naomi met his gaze. My version eliminates it, she replied.
No hesitation. No qualification.
Just certainty. The room absorbed that differently. Because elimination was not adjustment. It was redesign. One of the executives spoke up, his voice more grounded now. What does that require? He asked. Naomi turned slightly toward him. Control of the integration structure, she said. Ownership of the operational pipeline, not just the financial outcome. The distinction was immediate. They understood operations. They understood pipelines. But they had never centered them as the primary source of control. Naomi had. The junior analyst leaned forward again, his voice quiet but clear. That would shift internal authority beyond this board, he said. Naomi nodded once. Yes, she said. And it should. The simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it meant the structure they had relied on was no longer the final layer of decision-making. Edward exhaled slowly, his eyes still on her, no longer searching for weakness, but measuring the scope of what she was proposing. You are not just redefining this deal, he said. You are redefining the company. Naomi did not step back from that. She did not soften it. The company has already been redefined, she said. This is just where it becomes visible. The room went still again, but this time the stillness was not resistance. It was alignment beginning to form, not complete, not immediate, but inevitable. Naomi let her gaze move across the table one more time, steady, composed, grounded in everything that had led to this moment. For 10 years, she said, you made decisions believing control came from position. She paused, just long enough for that belief to surface in every mind. It does not. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet finality behind it now. Control comes from structure, and structure comes from the person who builds it before anyone else sees it. No one interrupted her. No one challenged her, because there was nothing left to challenge. The system they had trusted had already shifted beneath them. Naomi rested her hand back on the notebook, the same one she had used for a decade, now no longer a tool for observation, but a record of completion. So this is what moves forward, she said quietly. Not what you planned. She held the room in that moment, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity that could not be undone. What I built. No one spoke after that. Not because they disagreed, but because the shift had reached a point where resistance no longer made sense. The structure Naomi Carter described was not theoretical. It was already in motion, already layered into decisions they had made, documents they had signed, systems they had trusted without question. The realization was no longer arriving in fragments. It had settled completely. Edward Langford stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on Naomi, not searching for flaws anymore, but measuring what remained within his control. It was a different calculation now. Not how to lead the room, but how to survive the change within it. Then we are no longer operating under the same governance model, he said, his voice steady, but quieter, stripped of the authority it once carried. Naomi nodded once. No, she said. We are not. The confirmation did not create tension. It removed it. Because uncertainty had been replaced with clarity, even if that clarity was not comfortable. One of the senior executives leaned forward, his tone no longer cautious, but deliberate. If the governance model has shifted, he said, then the board itself is no longer the final layer of decision-making. Naomi turned her gaze toward him. That is correct, she said. The board remains part of the structure. It is no longer the structure. The distinction settled heavily. Because for years, they had believed the board was the highest point of authority. Now they were being told it was only one layer within something larger, something they had not seen being built. Edward exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting again, but this time not to regain control, to adapt. Then the question becomes implementation, he said. If the structure changes, the company changes with it. That requires alignment across every level. Naomi did not disagree. Yes, she said. It does. She stepped slightly closer to the table, not to dominate the space, but to center the conversation fully. And that alignment begins now, she added. The immediacy of that statement shifted the room again. This was not a future adjustment. This was a present transition. One of the executives glanced at the acquisition documents still displayed on the screen, almost forgotten now. Then this deal, he said, is no longer the priority. Naomi followed his gaze briefly, then returned her focus to the room. It is a component, she said, not the foundation. The language was precise. Components could be adjusted. Foundations could not. Edward nodded slightly, the movement subtle, but significant. Then the current proposal does not meet the new standard, he said. Naomi held his gaze. No, she replied. The answer was final.
No hesitation.
No room for reinterpretation. The deal, as it existed, was no longer valid. The room absorbed that quietly because they understood what it meant. Months of preparation, negotiation, alignment. All of it now subject to a structure they had not accounted for. The junior analyst sat back slowly, his eyes moving between the executives, then back to Naomi. So everything resets, he said, not as a question, but as a realization. Naomi shook her head slightly. Not everything, she said. Only what was built on assumptions that no longer apply. The distinction mattered, because it meant this was not destruction. It was correction. One of the senior executives leaned forward. Again, his expression focused, engaged in a way it had not been earlier in the meeting. Then what happens next, he asked. Naomi did not pause. She had already moved past that question long before it was asked. Next, she said, we rebuild alignment based on the actual structure, not the assumed one. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet momentum behind it now. Direction that could not be reversed. Every active deal is reviewed. Every decision point is recalibrated. Every layer of authority is clarified. She let each step land individually, not rushed, not compressed, because each one mattered. And anything that does not support long-term control, she added, does not move forward. The room did not resist. Not because they agreed completely, but because they understood the alternative no longer existed. Edward looked at her, his expression no longer defensive, no longer resistant. Focused. Analytical. And you lead that process, he said. Naomi did not claim it.
She did not need to.
I already am, she replied. The answer settled everything. Because leadership was no longer being assigned. It had already been established. The room fell into a different kind of silence now. Not uncertainty. Not tension. Alignment beginning to take shape. Naomi looked around the table one final time, her presence steady, grounded in everything that had led to this moment. For 10 years, she said, you believe this company moved forward because of the decisions made in this room. She paused, just long enough for that belief to surface one last time. It did not. Her voice remained calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. It moved forward because of the structure beneath those decisions. She rested her hand lightly on the notebook again, the same one that had recorded everything, now no longer needed for observation. And that structure, she said quietly, is no longer invisible. The room did not erupt into applause. There was no sudden reaction, no dramatic shift in tone, no raised voices trying to reclaim what had already been lost. Instead, something far more definitive settled over the space. Acceptance. Not loud, not immediate, but inevitable. Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence now fully understood for what it was. Not new, not sudden, just finally seen. The skyline behind her stretched endlessly, glass and steel reflecting a city that moved forward regardless of who thought they controlled it. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood something they had missed for 10 years. Control had never belonged to the loudest voice. It had belonged to the quietest mind. Edward Langford adjusted his stance slightly, not out of discomfort, but recalibration. The shift in him was subtle, but real. He was no longer trying to lead the room. He was trying to understand how to move within it. "Then we proceed under your structure," he said, his voice steady, no longer resistant. Naomi met his gaze. "We proceed under the correct structure," she replied. The distinction mattered. It always had. One of the senior executives nodded slowly, the movement almost automatic now, not out of agreement, but recognition. Because everything Naomi had laid out was already in place. Already active. Already shaping outcomes before they realized it. The junior analyst looked down at his notes, then back up at Naomi, his expression no longer uncertain. There was clarity there now. Respect that had not existed at the start of the meeting. "So this is what leadership looks like," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Naomi did not respond to that. She did not acknowledge the label. Because what she had done was not about appearing as a leader. It was about becoming one long before anyone else noticed. Edward glanced at the documents one last time, then closed them carefully, as if sealing the end of something that could not be reopened. "The revised structure," he said, "will need to be communicated across every division." Naomi nodded once. "It will be," she said, clearly.
No excess. No confusión.
Just clarity. That was the difference now. One of the executives leaned forward slightly, his tone measured but no longer guarded. "And the people who built their position under the previous model," he said, "they will need to adapt." Naomi looked at him, steady.
Composed.
"Or they will be replaced," she said. Not harsh. Not emotional. Just factual. The room absorbed that without reaction. Because by now, they understood something fundamental. Naomi Carter did not make statements for effect. She made them because they were already true. The meeting no longer felt like a meeting. It felt like a transition point. A line drawn between what had been and what would now be. Naomi reached for her notebook one last time, her fingers resting lightly on its cover. 10 years of silence lived inside those pages. 10 years of observation, of patience, of decisions made without needing to be announced. She picked it up, not as a tool anymore, but as something completed. Then she spoke, her voice calm, steady, carrying through the room without effort. "You spent 10 years believing I was silent because I had nothing to say," she said. No one interrupted. No one moved. Because they already knew where this was going. Naomi's gaze moved across the table, meeting each pair of eyes without hesitation. "But silence is not absence," she continued. "It is preparation." The words settled deeper than anything she had said before, because they reached back through every moment they had overlooked her, every assumption they had made, every time they had mistaken stillness for weakness. She paused, just long enough for that realization to fully land. Then she added, her voice unchanged, but final. "You thought I was taking notes," she said. "I was taking control." The room did not respond. It did not need to. Because the proof was already standing in front of them. Naomi turned toward the door, her movement unhurried, her presence leaving the center of the room as naturally as it had claimed it. She did not look back. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She had never needed it. And as the door closed behind her, the executives remained exactly where they were, not because they were unsure of what to do next, but because for the first time, they understood something they had missed for a decade. The most powerful person in the room is not the one who speaks first. It is the one who does not need to speak at all until the outcome is already theirs.